Hello BookTube, and welcome to the second of three videos where I'm talking about my reading experience with the biography of Catherine the Great, written by Virginia Rounding. So today we're going to look at chapters 8 to 13. Now, whereas in part 1 there was a real natural drama, wasn't there, to the story of Princess Sophie, traveling from what was then Pomerania on the northeast coast of Germany, all the way over to Russia, arriving in Moscow at the invitation of the then Empress Elizabeth, when Sophie was only 15 years old. Not only did she have to convert to a new religion, she had to learn a new language, and she had to work out how she was going to survive and thrive through all the intrigues of court. There was no doubt she was a highly intelligent woman, and yes, cunning. Cunning in order to work out the alliances that she needed to make, particularly within the army, which helped her to depose her own husband and take the crown of Russia for herself. I didn't have any difficulty, if you could even want to call it that, reading that first section that I covered in the last vlog. It half felt like I was reading a novel. Well, in this section, what we're going to look at now is how Catherine uses her power as Empress. My impression of this book, now that I've reached page 320, is that Rounding's target audience are people who read a lot, yes, but they have a slight preference for fiction over non-fiction. They can be persuaded to read non-fiction if the style and the manner of telling are engineered so that there is at least a little entertainment value in the midst of all the volume of fact which need to be conveyed. My impression is that Rounding has taken control of the number of times she quotes full dates, and also the number of people she's talking about, I suppose particularly within any 2 to 3 pages at one time. So the reader I never felt overwhelmed by the sheer number of names being brought to the foreground. She seems to keep it, almost engineer what she talks about so that she's speaking only about maybe 2 to 4 people at any one time. The second third of the biography, of course, is more about the holding and the working of power rather than the struggle to achieve it. And although that's less dramatic, I would say Rounding continued to keep the story interesting, and that's because I would say, and this would probably be seen by academics as a fault, but she does focus a little more on the personal rather than the political. And I'll talk about what that leaves out later on in the vlog. Catherine was crowned empress in 1762, September of that year. Virginia Rounding describes the coronation in some detail, and I'm not going to talk about it because, that would spoil it. It is worth a read, all the celebrations which accompanied it. This vlog is going to look at the next 15 years, so Catherine from the age of 33 to 48, but also her son, the Grand Duke Paul, from the age of 8 to the age of 23. It is the section of the book that shows Catherine as a very disciplined working monarch, and that was very different from the more haphazard working habits of her late mother-in-law, the Empress Elizabeth. What I'm going to say first is that from the start of her reign, Rounding shows us various writings by diplomats inside and outside Russia, rulers and members of Catherine's own court, who were uneasy about the fact that they had another woman at the helm. The biggest concern, of course, centered on the lovers that the Empress might take. The man of the moment at Catherine's coronation was an army officer called Grigory Orlov. Lovers were a problem if a ruler was female. If Catherine didn't marry Orlov, but she had any children by him, they would be illegitimate, and they would probably need to live away from court. If Catherine married, well, of course, the traditional gender roles meant that her husband would be the head of the family, and so you suddenly see her losing the superiority of her title, and then there would be the question of, would her husband gain any title, and therefore who was he to gain it? Any children that the couple had would be possible royal successors, and that would be a threat to the son that she had with Karl Peter, who was now the Grand Duke Paul. The line of succession could be sent in a completely different direction, and to some people that was not right. In fact, to some people, they assumed that what Catherine was going to do on her coronation was simply act as a regent and then hand over power as soon as young Paul reached the age of majority. Of course, Catherine is famous for her lovers. She didn't take any more, however, than any Russian emperor ever did. But of course, the sexual double standard means that what women do sexually gets noticed more and gets commented upon more. Also, the traditional gender roles meant that it was perceived that male lovers could be more disruptive to power structures at court than women could. Catherine does seem to have retained as best one can judge, warm feelings for almost all her lovers. And when the time came, as it always did, for one man to be distanced from her and another brought closer, the ex-lover was always gifted with land and serfs, money, precious objects, titles. New lovers had to learn Catherine's boundaries. If they could not be the traditional masters in this relationship, they had to get used to that. And they fell out of favor if Catherine suspected that their demands on her time were taking her away from her work as empress, or she suspected they were seeing other women. There is a story, which cannot be confirmed, that Catherine secretly married one of her lovers, the one that appears in the largest illustration here, Grigory Potemkin. If that did happen, it did not do much to prolong Potemkin's tenure as the empress' favorite. Middlemarch Meditation viewers may recall my video number 18, where I talked about the partitioning of Poland in the late 18th century. In that video, I said that the kings of Poland in the mid to late 18th century were all chosen by Russia. Now I have an example on page 180, and it also involves one of the men in this picture, the one on the far right. Okay, here we go. From page 180, plans were also afoot to deploy Stanislas Poniatowski to Russia's and ostensibly his own advantage. King Augustus III of Poland had died on 25th September 1763, provoking some excitement among the European rulers who wished to continue or extend their influence in that country. Catherine wrote to Panin, "Don't mock me because I leapt up from my chair when I heard the news about the death of the King of Poland. The King of Prussia jumped off the table when he heard." Panin's nephew by marriage, Prince Nikolai Repnin, was immediately dispatched to Warsaw with an endorsement of Stanislas as the Russian choice for the next king. Repnin, along with the Russian ambassador in Warsaw, was instructed to threaten force, even annexation of Polish territory, if there were any opposition to Poniatowski's candidacy. Russia had exercised an informal protectorate over Poland for decades, ever since Peter the Great guaranteed its constitution in 1716. Of course, it has to be said that I think Rounding is writing a very pro-Catherine biography. It's clear, reading between the lines, that although Catherine, yes, was a very intelligent, very capable woman, she also had a terrifying amount of power, and she did use it. And there are a lot of times when Rounding really doesn't talk about that in detail. And I think if I were reading another biography, I would look out deliberately for an author where I could tell that their take was different, where they wanted to look at some of the less pleasant things about her reign. But for now, let's look at a couple of things that I did find admirable about Catherine. One was her attention that she took to the reforming of Russian law. To quote a letter from Catherine, Russian law was voluminous to a degree of greatest absurdity, perplexed, insufficient, and in many cases contradictory. So in 1767, Catherine set up a legislative commission to review all Russian laws and modify or replace legislation as needed. There were no legal experts in Russia at the time. Catherine had to draw on her reading, which had come from Enlightenment works such as Montesquieu's L'Esprit de Loi and the Institution Politique by the Prussian writer Jakob Friedrich von Bielefeld. Catherine remained a great reader. That also anybody who is a reader can admire. And she encouraged the women around her, including her future daughters-in-law, to avoid idleness by reading in their spare time. As Empress, Catherine could reach out and correspond with any of the literary greats in Europe. And of course, we know that one of her longest friendships was with Diderot, the author of the great encyclopedia. And there is a story that when Diderot was in dire need, such that he was going to have to put his whole library up for sale just to keep himself eating, Catherine bought all the books herself. And she did it, she paid more than the asking price, and she made it a condition of purchase that the books had to remain with Diderot while he was alive, and she awarded him an annual pension. So, obviously those two became very good friends, and Diderot and Voltaire spent time at the Russian court on Catherine's invitation. Obviously, Diderot adored the Empress. But on his visits, he tried to persuade Catherine to make changes, to make ideological changes to the way Russia was governed. For example, he wanted to encourage the abolition of serfdom Catherine wrote about her reactions to the French intellectual's advice on pages 278 to 279. So this is where you start to see another side of things. Let me just go there and read. This is Catherine speaking. I had long and frequent conversations with Diderot, but with more curiosity than profit. If I had followed his advice, everything would have been turned upside down in my empire. Legislation, administration, politics, finance. I would have upset everything in order to substantiate impractical theories from them. Nevertheless, as I listened to him more than I spoke, anyone witnessing us both would have taken him for a severe pedagogue and me for his humble pupil. He probably thought this himself, for after some time, seeing that none of the great innovations he had recommended to me had been implemented in my government, innovations such as the abolition of serfdom, that's inserted by the author, he expressed his surprise to me with a sort of displeased haughtiness. And so, speaking to him frankly, I said, Monsieur Diderot, I have listened with the greatest pleasure to everything which your brilliant mind has inspired you to say. But with all your ground principles, which I understand perfectly well, one could produce good books and bad governance. You forget, in all your plans of reform, the difference between our two positions. You work only on paper, which permits everything. It is uniform, supple, and presents no obstacles either to your imagination or to your pen, whereas in my case, poor empress that I am, I work on human parchment, which is, on the contrary, irritable and sensitive. I am convinced that after that he took pity on me, regarding me as a narrow and vulgar person. From then on, he talked to me only about literature, and politics disappeared from our conversation. In the same way that Catherine had been chosen as a bride, she also took on the responsibility of selecting a new Grand Duchess when her son Paul came of age, and she chose her potential daughters-in-law from the Prussian aristocracy. The first princess chosen, who's shown here, Wilhelmina of Hesse-Darmstadt, came to the Russian court, converted to the Orthodox faith, just as Catherine had done, and she received the new name of Natalia Alexievna. Paul and Natalia were married a month later, in September 1773. The saddest, the most horrifying episode in this biography was the death of Natalia in 1776, when she went into labor with her first child. Caesarean section was a very new technique for delivering babies in the 18th century. Very few doctors knew how to perform one. It was almost guaranteed the mother would die. And in addition, not many newborns survived the process either. No one was capable of attempting a C-section for Natalia, and there was no other way she would be able to deliver the child. And so the baby died in the womb, and she died 5 days later from the subsequent infection. It was a very chilling reminder of just how dangerous childbirth used to be. And of course, it was also a shock to my modern sensibilities when Rounding started talking about how quickly Catherine set about in search of another replacement for Natalia, days after that young woman had died. We'll see on page 302, I'll read you the to-do list that Catherine drew up, as I say, just a few days after this princess died. 1. First thing tomorrow, I will ask Prince Henry, this was Prince Henry of Prussia, who was related to Frederick the Great, to send a courier and write to the Princess of Württemberg to persuade her to come to Berlin with the 2 princesses, her daughters, as soon as possible. 2. In a few days from now, His Imperial Highness, the Grand Duke Paul, will say out loud that he would like to go to Riga or Reval for rest and recuperation. A few days after that, he will say that he has permission to go to Riga and that he would like to see the works on the Dvina. He will say no more than that. This journey will dovetail with the time the Princess of Württemberg arrives in Berlin. His Imperial Highness and His Royal Highness, i.e. Prince Henry, will leave here together. They will go to Riga and from there straight to Berlin to see the princesses. His Imperial Highness will write to let me know his choice, a definite yes or no, and then he will return. In the case of a yes, I will appoint Prince Henry the bearer of my word, and the consent obtained I will be written to so that I can send the Field Marshal's wife and all her entourage to Memel, where the princesses will come and place the bride-to-be into the hands of the people nominated to receive her. 5. The future Duchess will embrace the Greek religion in Petersburg, where the betrothal and marriage will also take place. 6. The princess, her mother and sister will return from Memel to Berlin. 7. Silence. until all this is underway. It was such a different world. But I can say one thing in Catherine's favour, and should do. Her reading made her familiar with the English medic Dr. Dimsdale, who was writing about the benefits of using inoculation to combat smallpox. Now, Catherine was forward-looking enough to invite the doctor to come to Moscow. She had herself and the Grand Duke inoculated against smallpox to set the example, and then she ensured that vaccines were made available to the general population. As I've said, this biography has tended to focus more on Catherine and what happened around her personally, more than the political, if I could say that. I mean, we do get the political, but probably in doses that, well, let me give you two examples. There are two events which are mentioned, which they could be examined more deeply. They could be subjects of study in their own right. One was the war that Russia fought against the Ottoman Empire starting in 1769. And then there was also the internal Cossack rebellion, led by the gentleman you see in the picture here, Emelian Pugachev, who pretended to be Catherine's late husband, Peter III, not dead, secretly, taken away and reappearing now. And Pugachev amassed a private army. He began to take over several towns and villages, and he set up his own court at Orenburg. Now, he was, of course, overthrown, captured in the end, and executed. And, of course, he was lionized by the Soviet Union, as you see in this postage stamp illustration, as leading one of the first proletariat revolutions against dictatorship and tyranny. So that's interesting. The biography doesn't go into that a great deal. It just kind of deals with it as Catherine was almost unaware of it because of other things going on. She sent men out, she sent military men out to deal with it, but obviously she was never close to the fighting or action. So I would like to know a little bit more about that particular part of Russian history. According to online sources that I did have a quick look at, that rebellion is supposed to have changed the Empress, made her less progressive and more oppressive. At this point in the biography, she still seems to be forward-thinking, but we shall see. And at the end of chapter 13, where I got to, Catherine has a new daughter-in-law, the second Duchess, who gives birth to a healthy son named Alexander. And I think that's an appropriate point to close this vlog. I'm going to report back again now when I finish the book entirely. And in the meantime, I wish everybody happy April reading. Take care of yourself. Bye-bye.